I thought tonight would be simple. 32 years old, raising a 5-year-old daughter alone in the southern quarter of Valdoran, I had convinced myself that a quiet dinner with Clara was exactly what I needed. Clara was kind, soft-spoken, a teacher at the scriptorium where Lila learned her letters. She never asked questions that cut too deep. She smiled easily. She felt safe. I left Lila with my sister, kissed my daughter's forehead, and walked to the Bell of Ash with something close to hope in my chest. The tavern was warm and loud, filled with the usual mix of human merchants, dwarf smiths, and the occasional elf scholar. Clara was already at our table, her fingers tracing the rim of a wineglass. We talked about Lila's latest drawing, about the new shipment of inks arriving from the south, about nothing that hurt. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders loosen. Then the door opened. She stepped inside like the night itself had taken form. Lady Vespera Corin, commander of the Black Dragon Seal Trading Guild. 10 feet of green-skinned power wrapped in dark leather and silver, her long black hair bound with a single iron ring. 2 noble clients flanked her, but I barely saw them. My eyes locked onto hers the moment she crossed the threshold. Vespera's gaze swept the room the way it always did, assessing threats, allies, lies. Then it found me. Everything inside me froze. She saw Clara's hand resting lightly on mine. She saw the half-empty plates, the candlelight between 2 humans who looked like they belonged together. For one heartbeat, her amber eyes cracked open, showing something raw and sharp beneath the iron mask she wore for the world. Then she turned away. She murmured something to her companion, spun on her heel, and left the tavern without ordering a single drink. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that sounded louder than any slam. I couldn't hear anything Clara said after that. I finished the meal on autopilot, offered clumsy apologies about a sudden guild matter, and walked Clara home like a gentleman. She was too gentle to press me. But when I finally reached my small rented house, collected a sleepy Lila from my sister, and tucked my daughter into bed, the weight of that single glance pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I sat at the worn table with a single oil lamp flickering low. Lila's soft breathing drifted from the next room. The house smelled of wood smoke and yesterday's bread. I stared at the communication stone on the table, the enchanted slate every high-ranking guild member carried. It stayed dark. I told myself that was for the best. 8 months ago, Vespera had pushed me out of her guild and out of her life for my own good. I had spent every day since trying to build something stable for Lila, a normal life, a quiet one. Then just before midnight, the stone flared to life. Emerald light spilled across the table. One line of glowing text appeared, written in the elegant angular script I would recognize anywhere. I thought I had moved on, but it turns out I haven't. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard my hand shook when I touched the stone. I stared at those words until they burned behind my eyes. Vespera, the woman who had once been my commander, the orc who had taught me that strength and mercy could live in the same breath, the only person who had ever made the hollow place inside my chest feel full. I didn't hesitate. My fingers pressed against the cool surface, and I answered with the only truth I still owned. I never did. The stone pulsed once, almost gently. A second line appeared almost immediately. Tomorrow, the Western Lake Garden. The hour of the serpent. We need to talk. I closed my fingers around the stone until the edges bit into my palm. In the next room, Lila made a small sound in her sleep. I thought about the life I had scraped together for her, the steady job at the new guild, the quiet evenings, the fragile peace I had fought so hard to keep. And I thought about Vespera, standing in that tavern doorway, the brief fracture in her iron gaze, when she saw another woman's hand on mine. I knew then with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that the story I thought I had buried 8 months ago had never really died. It had only been waiting for one careless glance across a crowded room to come back to life. 3 years ago, I was not the man sitting across from Clara in the Bell of Ash pretending the past didn't exist. 3 years ago, I was barely keeping my head above water. My wife had walked out one freezing winter night, leaving nothing but a short note on the kitchen table and an empty side of the bed. She said she wasn't made for this life. The cramped rented rooms that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair, the endless scraping for coin, the crying baby who never seemed to stop. She followed a southern merchant caravan and never looked back. She left me with Lila, who was barely 2 years old, and a silence in the house that felt louder than any scream. I needed a real job. Not the odd scribal work copying ledgers or mending sails that paid just enough to keep us from starving. I needed steady hours, steady pay, and someone who understood that my daughter was not a burden I could set down when it became inconvenient. So when the Black Dragon Seal Guild posted a notice for a correspondence clerk in their foreign affairs branch, I applied, even though every person in Valdoran knew it was almost impossible for a human with no connections. The woman who interviewed me was Vespera Corin. She was 35, then already the youngest orc ever to command a major branch of the guild in the city. She sat behind a massive desk of dark wood wearing soft leather armor beneath a black cloak trimmed with silver. Her amber eyes scanned my application for a long time before she spoke. "What is this 2-year gap?" she asked, voice low and direct. I could have lied. I could have said I was caring for a sick relative or working freelance. Instead, I told her the truth. My wife had left. I had stayed home to raise our daughter alone. I had learned to be both mother and father while trying not to fall apart. And now I needed work that understood my child wasn't something I could set aside when it became inconvenient. I waited for the pity or the polite rejection. Vespera was silent for a long moment. Then she closed the folder. "My father raised 3 of us alone after my mother died in a rage," she said quietly. "A father does not become weaker because of his children. He only becomes more tired." She looked at me, then really looked. "You're hired, but do not make me regret it." That was how it started. Working for Vespera was harder than I had imagined. She was merciless with details. Every contract I drafted came back covered in red ink. Every diplomatic letter had to be rewritten until there was not a single weak word left. She hated vagueness, hated flattery, hated lateness, hated anyone who used their personal circumstances as an excuse for sloppy work. But she was also fair in a way that cut deeper than cruelty. When Lila came down with a fever that lasted 3 days, Vespera did not dock my pay. She did not scold me. She sent the guild's own healer to my door without being asked. The next day, she appeared at my doorstep herself, carrying a pot of orc-style bone broth and 2 illustrated storybooks. "My father used to read to me when I was sick," she said almost reluctantly. "Children everywhere are afraid of being ill the same way." Lila fell in love with her that night. My daughter laughed until she cried as Vespera read the stories in different voices: deep dragon roars, high elf songs, growling monsters. When Lila finally fell asleep, Vespera and I sat by the window with cheap wine and talked about fathers who had to be everything at once. For the first time, I saw Vespera not as the terrifying commander, but as a person who carried her own scars. And for the first time, she called me by my name instead of clerk. That was the night everything truly began. 1 year later, the entire city of Valdoran knew that if you needed a contract saved from collapse, a treaty worded so perfectly it could disarm an angry dwarf lord, or a failing negotiation turned into victory, you asked for Vespera Corin and me. We had become the most effective pair in the Black Dragon Seal Guild. She read power the way other people read faces. I understood language tone and the small psychological cracks that turned threats into agreements. In meetings, we moved like 2 halves of the same mind. One glance from her across the table, and I knew exactly which point she wanted me to press. One pause from me, and she would lean forward and deliver the killing line before the other side even realized they were losing. It should have stayed professional, clean, safe, but it didn't. Vespera began appearing at our door on rainy evenings with excuses that grew thinner each time. I was passing by. The healer said Lila's cough might need orc bone broth. I brought the revised Eastern trade maps. She would stay for dinner, then help Lila with her letters, then read her those ridiculous dragon stories in the deep, rumbling voices that made my daughter laugh until she cried. Sometimes she lingered after Lila fell asleep, sitting by the window with me, sharing cheap wine and quiet stories about fathers who had carried too much alone. Lila started calling her Aunt Vespera without anyone correcting her. I told myself it was harmless. Just 2 colleagues who understood each other. Just a lonely orc commander who had never been allowed softness, and a tired human father who had forgotten what it felt like to breathe easy. Then came the Mirhaven Trade Summit. 3 days of negotiations that could have broken the guild if they went wrong. We worked side by side until our voices were hoarse. When the final agreement was signed and the hall erupted in applause, the guildmaster actually smiled, something no one had seen in years. That night after the formal banquet, Vespera and I ended up alone on the rooftop terrace overlooking the glowing harbor. The air was cool, the wine stronger than usual. She had allowed herself 2 full glasses, more than I had ever seen her drink. "We are too good together," she said, staring at the lights on the water. I smiled. "That should be a compliment. In work it is." She turned to face me. "Outside of work, it makes me want to do something stupid. I don't remember which of us moved first. All I remember is the sudden heat of her mouth on mine, the way her large hand cradled the back of my head like I was something precious and breakable, and the low sound she made in her throat when I kissed her back. It wasn't gentle. It was 8 months of stolen glances and swallowed words finally breaking free. When we pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard. Vespera rested her forehead against mine. "This cannot happen," she whispered. "Not while I am your commander." I knew she was right. Guild rules were ironclad. Any romantic involvement between superior and subordinate meant immediate dismissal for the lower rank. And if I lost this position, I lost everything I had built for Lila. 2 months later, Vespera called me into her office, closed the door, and handed me a sealed letter of transfer. I recommended you to the Silver Reed branch, she said, voice steady, but eyes refusing to meet mine. Higher position, better pay, hours that will let you be home with Lila every night. And you will no longer report to me. I stared at the letter. You're sending me away. I am giving you a future, she answered. One that does not end with both of us destroyed. She never touched me again after that day. I accepted the transfer. Everyone congratulated me on the promotion. Only the two of us knew it was a goodbye wrapped in official parchment. For the next 8 months, we were careful. Painfully careful. We nodded politely when we passed each other in the guild halls. We kept our eyes on documents instead of each other. We never spoke of what had happened on that rooftop. But every time I saw her tall figure moving through the corridors, something inside my chest still pulled tight. Every time Lila asked, "When is Aunt Vespera coming to read again?" I had to swallow the answer that hurt too much to say out loud. I thought I was getting better at living without her. Then one ordinary Tuesday night in a quiet tavern called the Bell of Ash, Vespera walked through the door while I was sitting across from another woman, and everything I thought I had buried came roaring back to life. I arrived at the Western Lake Garden almost half an hour early. The sky was still pale with morning light, the water smooth as glass. I had changed shirts 3 times before leaving the house, then walked in circles around the same bench until I felt ridiculous. Lila was safe with my sister. The city was just waking up, and yet my heart hammered like I was 20 years old again, waiting for something I wasn't allowed to want. Vespera appeared exactly at the hour of the serpent. She wasn't wearing the black and silver uniform of the Black Dragon seal. No cloak, no iron ring in her hair, no visible weapons. Just a thick gray wool tunic, riding trousers, and her long black hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She looked smaller somehow. Not in size, she was still the tallest person in any room, but in presence, like she had finally set down the weight of command for a few hours. She walked straight to the bench and sat beside me without speaking. For a long moment, we both watched the lake. Ducks glided across the water. A light wind moved through the willow trees. Then she spoke. "I left the guild 2 weeks ago." I turned to her so fast my neck hurt. "Would I accepted a position with the Kestrel Meridian Caravan in the Northern Territories. Higher rank, different responsibilities. No overlap with Silver Reed." She kept her eyes on the water. I told myself it was for the guild, for better opportunities. But the truth is simpler. I couldn't stay in the same building as you anymore and pretend I was fine. My throat tightened. "You did all that? Because of me?" Vespera finally looked at me. Her amber eyes were raw in the morning light. "I saw you last night," she said quietly, "with her, the teacher. I saw the way she touched your hand and smiled like she belonged there, and something inside me cracked. 8 months of telling myself I had moved on, that pushing you away was the right thing, that I was protecting both of us. It all fell apart in 1 second. She let out a slow breath. "I remember you, Theron, not as my former subordinate, not as the skilled clerk who could turn any negotiation. I remember the man who stayed up all night writing letters while his daughter slept on his shoulder. The man who never once complained. The man who made me laugh on the worst days. I remember every single thing we never allowed ourselves to have." The words landed in my chest like stones. I looked down at my hands. I never moved on either. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full. "I know Lila comes first," Vespera said after a while. "I would never ask you to choose. I'm not here to rush in and play mother. I can't keep pretending this doesn't exist anymore. Not after last night." I reached out slowly and took her hand. It was the first time I had touched her since that night on the Muirhaven rooftop. Her fingers closed around mine, immediately warm and certain. "I want to try," I told her, "but not in secret. Not in the shadows. Lila has already lost one parent. If we do this, we do it honestly. Slowly. We tell her the truth when the time is right. And if it doesn't work, we make sure she never feels like she lost someone else." Vespera nodded without hesitation. "That is the only way I would ever want it." We stayed on that bench for hours talking about real things instead of dreams. About how we would balance our new positions. About boundaries with Lila. About what slow actually meant. About the fear that still lived in both of us after everything we had already survived. When we finally stood to leave, Vespera lifted her hand and brushed her fingers lightly against my cheek. The touch was so gentle it made my eyes sting. "I won't come tonight," she said. "But if you want, this weekend I could come for dinner. With Lila. No pressure, just dinner." I smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "She's going to make you do the dragon voice again." Vespera's mouth curved in that rare crooked smile I had missed more than I let myself admit. "I've been practicing." She walked away through the willows, tall and steady, but lighter than I had seen her in months. I stayed by the lake a while longer, watching the water catch the rising sun. For the first time since my wife left, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I might actually get to live. Vespera arrived on Friday evening carrying a bottle of northern honey wine and a thick illustrated storybook about red dragons fighting silver unicorns. The moment I opened the door, Lila let out a delighted squeal that could probably be heard across the street. Aunt Vespera. My daughter launched herself forward and wrapped her arms around Vespera's leg as if the 8 months apart had never happened. Vespera froze for half a second, the powerful commander who once terrified entire guild halls, then carefully lifted Lila up with one arm like she weighed nothing at all. You grew. Vespera said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. You came back, Lila answered, as if that was the only thing that mattered in the world. Dinner was simple spice stew, fresh bread, and honey cakes, but the kitchen felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Lila chattered non-stop about school, her newest drawings, and how the neighbor's cat had kittens. Vespera listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made my daughter beam with pride. I watched them across the table and felt something tight in my chest finally loosen. After we ate, Vespera read the new storybook to Lila. She did the dragon voice again, deep rumbling and completely ridiculous, and my daughter laughed so hard she nearly fell off the couch. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, memorizing every second of it. When Lila finally fell asleep, Vespera and I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the honey wine. Thank you for tonight, I said quietly. Vespera shook her head. I should be the one thanking you for letting me be here. We talked for a long time that night, about the future, about taking things slow, about how we would tell Lila when the time was right, about not rushing anything that could hurt my daughter. We made promises, real ones this time, and for the first time since my wife left, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I might actually get to live. The months that followed were some of the gentlest I had ever known. Then one golden autumn afternoon a year later, I took Vespera to see a small house on the southern edge of Valdoran. It wasn't grand, but it had 2 floors, a backyard for Lila to play in, and a little workshop in the back where I could work. I handed her the key while we stood in the middle of the stone bridge overlooking the garden where we had first talked after that midnight message. I don't have a ring yet, I said, but if you'll accept this first, I think the rest of my life knows exactly where it wants to go. Vesper looked at the key for a long moment, then closed her fingers around it. I accept the house, she said, her voice thick, and the rest of it too. That evening, when we told Lila we were moving to a new house together, my daughter looked at both of us with serious eyes and asked the most important question of all. Does that mean Aunt Vespera is staying with us forever? I looked at Vespera. She knelt down in front of Lila so they were eye to eye. If that's what you want too, she answered gently. Lila threw her arms around Vespera's neck without hesitation. I want that. I really, really want that. Standing there in our old cramped house, watching my daughter hug the woman I loved, I finally understood something. I had spent so long thinking I had to move on from Vespera, but some things aren't meant to be moved on from. Some things are meant to be come home to.